For my watercolor techniques, now that I have all these shapes drawn and I have everything labeled, I know what I'm going to put in which spot. I have a cup of water, my watercolors, I have some salt, and I have a tissue for my techniques. So the first thing I'm going to do is the wash. I dip my paintbrush in the water and pick a color, any color. Now, when you put your brush in the paint, make sure that you're not digging it in, okay? We're not digging for gold. We're just trying to get a little bit of paint on our brush. Now for a wash, we want it to be pretty wet. We don't want it very dry. So it should glisten a little bit because it's wet. Now, when we're painting, you're holding your brush like a pencil and you're going to pull the brush down or across. A wash means that you have an even distribution of color. So I'm being very, very careful and meticulous to stay in the lines, and I don't want any of this pooling that's happening. So I'm going to pull that color over, and I want it to stay nice and even. Just like the paint that's in the tray, I want to make sure that I am not digging into the paper. The paper is very, very delicate. We don't want to rip or tear it. And in that sense, we're also not going to be applying too much water. If you apply too much water to the paper, it will rip and tear. Now, between every color, you need to rinse your brush. So you just swirl it around in the water, and then you can get the excess off from the side. Dry brush technique, that means that I'm getting a color that's already wet, that's been used, but my brush itself is dry. Since I've already used the purple and it's still wet, I want to dry off my brush. I'm not going to use my whole tissue because I need it for a technique later. So I'm just going to pat it off a little bit. My brush is pretty dry. I don't want to separate any of the bristles though, so I want them to stay together. It should still be a little damp. So you're very gentle with your brush. Take care of it. Now I just dipped a little bit into that, and this time it's okay if the bristles separate a little bit. This is a dry brush technique. This is so that you actually get some of the texture of the brush. What are some things I could use that for? Oh yeah, maybe hair, grass. All right, anything that looks a little rough. Now I rinse my brush between colors. I'm going to do wet on wet. So that means that I'm applying wet paint to an area on the paper that's already wet. Well, I could use just water on the paper, and I have to be very careful not to apply too much because I don't want to mess up my paper. Get my paintbrush wet again. I'm going to change colors this time. Let's do, I like this green, this blue-green. So I just swirled my paintbrush in there, and when I touch it to this area that's wet, it blooms and grows. Okay, so now I'm going to make an area that's just this color. I'm going to rinse my brush, and while that's still wet, I have to go fast. I'm going to pick up another color and touch. And then the same thing happens here, is that those colors kind of bloom and mix together. And then I just got into some of the water. So you can see that anywhere that wet watercolor touches an already wet surface, it moves and it grows. Compared to my wet paintbrush on the dry paper, I got a clean line, but this blended very nicely into the white of the paper. So if you're trying to get a nice gradient, that would be a good way to go. Salt is my next technique. Rinse my brush. And I want to make sure that I still have plenty of water on that because I'm going to change colors. I'm going to use orange for this one. With the salt technique, It works best if you get a color that's kind of dark, not yellow or yellow-green. So I'm going to apply a wash. Rinse my brush, set it to the side, and before this dries, just get a little pinch of salt and sprinkle it on. So the salt is actually repelling the paint. It will soak some directly into the salt itself, but then it makes it kind of bloom outwards where all the color gets pushed away from the salt. It's really cool. Graffito. Graffito is going to be a really interesting technique. There's a few ways that you can do this. Graffito is the Italian word for scratch. So you can use, if you're at home, you can use a fork or a knife, or you can find a toothpick or something, or if you're in the classroom, you can use the end of a colored pencil or anything that kind of has a sharp end. And you can just scratch any design into it. Be careful with the colored pencils. Some of that lacquer came off. This also happens sometimes if you erase your pencil and paint over it. You're making indentations into the paper, which you can't really see on the camera, and it's only visible from a certain angle when the light catches it. So I'm going to use kind of a dark color. I like purple. I'm going to do a wash. Now I don't want my paint to be too wet because I don't want it to completely soak into those grooves. There we go. Very nice. So with a dry brush, it actually works a little bit better because you can actually see the white line. When it's really wet, sometimes it also soaks into the groove and it ends up darker. So it kind of depends on what look you're going for. But with graffito, it's all about how deep those scratches are. And it's a very, very careful balance of how wet or dry your paintbrush is. And I can always go back in and kind of scratch after, but it's not as effective. Well, on camera, I guess it is. But I did scratch the paper a little bit because it's wet, so you have to be very, very careful. You don't want to rip through the page. Let's check. Yeah, I'm getting there. Last technique. Tissue paper. So the tissue is going to lift, it's also called a lift, any color that you have. Now you can do a wash, you could do a wet on wet. Either way you want to approach this. But it needs to be wet paint, so dry brush is not okay for this one. I'm going to get that yellow-orange. Oh, it came out very yellow. So notice when I'm getting more color, I'm not dipping it back into the water. I'm just using the wet paint that's already there. I'm being very, very gentle. Now, you're going to get your tissue and just dab. This could be a good technique if you're just trying to lift up any mistakes, but just remember, keep in mind, it's not getting all of the color. It will leave some behind. So it's just a very pale yellow. It's not white. This might be a good technique for clouds if you're going to include clouds in your drawing. And with that, we are done with our watercolor techniques. Thank you for joining me.